Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream, brought to you by Hordes Dairyman, and I'm Corey Geiger, Managing Editor. COVID-19 has certainly upended daily life. Despite the disruption in the marketplace, there have been some positive developments. In the Badger State, leadership at Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture were able to get Target stores to lift its national directive on limiting dairy product sales, in particular, milk. The American Dairy Association Northeast, out Andy's way, partnered with Dairy Farmers of America to distribute milk to thousands of needy families. Each of these groups received over 4,000 gallons of milk in the last 7 days. The Share Food Program in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Saratoga County, New York, City Harvest in Queens, New York, Rolling Harvest in Hightstown, New Jersey, and the Fayette Food Bank in Republic, Pennsylvania. So there are good news out there, despite the topic today that we have is milk dumping. And there's one other great feel-good story here. There's a simple act of milk hauler Rich Miller using $5,000 of his own money to donate cheese curds from the Ellsworth Creamery to a local food pantry. That one-kind act created a groundswell of donations to food pantries throughout the Twin Cities area. I'm pleased to have Mark Stephenson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Andy Novakovic, and Chris Wolf here with both of Cornell. Before we get going into their opening comments, we have a poll question, and Jim, if you'd put that up on the screen for us. What crisis caused the highest peak federal government spending as a percentage of the gross domestic product? So all of our listeners out there, you can go ahead and answer this. A is coronavirus of 2020. B is the financial crisis of 2009. C is World War II at its peak in 1945. Or D is the New Deal, and you know that took place in the Great Depression of 1936. So go ahead and answer your question here. We're getting quite a few votes here of our attendees so far. Over half of them already cast their ballots. And Jim, when you feel that we got a good sampling here, we can go ahead and close the poll here. And I think this will be a great setup as to the economic situation that we're dealing with. So the answers have come in here, and we're seeing that the number one poll answer is the coronavirus of 2020. And indeed, that is second place. At its peak in World War II, we spent 40% of our gross domestic product on winning the war. But coronavirus right now is at 35%. And what I know Andy, Mark, and Chris will share with us is that spending has just begun. In third place was the financial crisis of 2009. And believe it or not, even if what all we read in the history books of the Great Depression, only 10% of the gross domestic product was spent during the New Deal. So we'll go back to webcams here. And as we weave through this issue of milk dumping, we're going to start with the consumer and the marketplace. And first up is Andy Novakovic. Andy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Corey. And in fact, thanks on behalf of all of us for having Hordes Dairyman, you and your staff host this. I think it's a terrific thing, and you made it possible. So thank you. The first thing I want to say is a sentence that I find myself using often when I'm talking to folks in the media. And that is to just remind people that the milk and dairy food supply chain, I think, is incredibly robust. It's a supply chain that routinely has to deal with stuff on a daily basis and certainly on a seasonal basis. And, you know, think about the ice storms or the hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever kind of weather you guys have in your areas. Those are huge challenges. Many of you have probably experienced it. And over the course of time, all pieces of the supply chain, hauling, farming, processing, have learned how to deal with this, and I think it's pretty nimble. It goes without saying that the current situation is unprecedented. It's massive. It kind of took us mostly by surprise, and it's got everybody scrambling. But I really think we have to kind of give all of ourselves a pat on the back, all the way down to the retailer for rising to the occasion. If there's ever a time when milk prices drop, Mark and Chris and Corey and all of us get questions about what are we going to do about this excess production. And as an economist, I often feel like, well, why don't we talk about insufficient demand? Why is this burden always on production? And think about the 15% reduction in Class 1 sales that have occurred since 2010 as an example. If ever there was an apt description for the current environment related to demand, this is it. And the word that people use is demand destruction. Sounds a little hyperbolic for a lot of situations, but it's exactly the right word for today. And it's also reminding us that milk goes into dairy products, and those dairy products go into a lot of channels, lots of different ways in which we use lots of different products. The four big ones are food retailing, food service, restaurants, hospitality type uses, institutional use, which typically means things like a cafeteria, but it's more like a school cafeteria or a prison or a business cafeteria. So like food service, but a little bit different. And then food manufacturing, where dairy is an ingredient in some other food. That pizza would be a good example, mac and cheese, but you think of all the baked goods with whey proteins and so on. And we're finding that the big impact, of course, is food service, which represents probably at least a third of the usages of all dairy products, and for some dairy products, a lot more. So, for example, if we look at fluid milk, the home use of fluid milk is about 2/3 of the total fluid milk supply, and of course, schools and a little bit of hospitality uses fluid milk, but primarily we drink fluid milk at home. If you look at cheese and butter, it's over half that goes into food service. And so clearly those products are taking a much bigger hit. But even there, it's not uniform. It depends on what style of cheese. If you're in the processed cheese business, it's a lot bigger deal than if you're in regular cheddar cheese, for example. The other thing that I think we kind of need to think about in terms of how it's impacted downstream is we can think of products as either being fresh or storable or actually aged or delayed in their sale. And so the big challenge for us now has been with fresh products, things that you typically turn around pretty quickly. You make it and it's sold within the next week or 2 weeks, maybe even a few days, like fluid milk would be. And there's clearly been some pipeline effects where people have come in and walked out with, grocery carts filled with fluid milk, which completely defies my ability to explain, but it's happened. And so we've got a challenge to refill that pipeline, but that's happening. There are storable products that range from limited storage, like a yogurt or an ice cream, to things that can be stored for a much longer period of time. Of course, the powdered milks would be the big one. But there are also products that we make with the intention of holding on to them and selling them later. So, for example, this is a time of year when we make cheese and butter that we intend to sell at Thanksgiving and Christmas and January. And so all of those come into play in terms of whether or not you can keep a plant full, whether or not a plant has a customer, whether or not the plant is getting revenue for what they're producing, and so on. The last thing that I'll mention is transportation is a huge part of all of this. And in the main, transportation is an independent business. There are a few places where the dairy industry owns its own fleet, but by and large, we're relying on other people's businesses to keep those trucks rolling. And in the main, I would say that's actually performing very well. Needless to say, traffic's not too heavy these days. That probably helps a little bit. But there's certainly an issue and a concern about worker safety and making sure that all of those people, including truck drivers, stay healthy and prevent themselves from becoming infected. And so far, that's looking pretty good. But there are instances where we've seen problems. And the Northeast is one of those areas where folks are not sick, but they're really nervous about driving into New York City and risking becoming sick. And so that's another aspect of the downstream supply chain that we've seen some challenges in. So that's my overview. Thank you, Corey. Back to you.
Thank you, Andy. And certainly in the United States, New York City and its metropolitan area has been an epicenter for COVID-19. Before I introduce Mark Stephenson, I'd certainly want to give credit here to some of our teammates. Jim Baltz is making this all work here down in Illinois, and Caitlin Allen and Maggie Seiler and our team are helping here in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. Next up, we have Mark Stephenson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, And let's turn our attention to the processing and milk hauling component. It's the all-important connection between the consumer and the farm. Mark?
Well, thanks, Corey. And yeah, there really are lots of pieces that maybe we oftentimes don't think about that sit somewhere in the middle between, the farm producing milk and the retail store that has run out of milk on the shelves. This is clearly a situation that we've got people in the middle that have been scrambling. Andy mentioned it just briefly, but we need to recognize that not only do we have demand destruction, as Andy called it, but we had just a huge amount of demand change that happened over a period of time. And as we've stopped eating out in restaurants, the kinds of dairy products that have been asked for in retail stores and where we've had demand actually showing an increase there has altered a good bit. A good example might be much of our American processed cheese, those singles that get put on a hamburger at fast food, is down quite a bit. The barrel cheese plants that provide that substrate for that material have lost a lot of sales. And as the retail demand for fluid milk has increased dramatically, we've had an industry scrambling behind the scenes to not be taking milk to some of those barrel plants and taking it to fluid plants. And you don't think about some of the other input streams that go into a fluid plant, but they're geared up for a certain number of bottles that they can make, under a blow mold circumstance. And maybe they don't have all of the inputs that are needed to meet that surge in demand that happens shortly. So the industry's been scrambling to try to keep up, and I think they have done an admirable job of making those changes. But we've still had some product that hasn't made it to the store shelves. And part of the reason is that we've had milk that has not been able to find a market home. And you might ask the question, why hasn't it found a market home? We're going to talk, I think, a little bit more today about milk that actually got dumped and is being dumped, which says that we didn't have a place for it, or we couldn't get it there in time, or economically couldn't find a place for it. But we also have a lot of sales of milk and dairy product that are being sold at what's commonly referred to as distressed milk prices, which is to say that this is milk that could find a home, but only if the price was right, lower than federal order minimum prices in the area. And the dumped milk is milk that didn't even have that kind of home or that kind of level there. I did a little bit of calling around to see just what exactly was the magnitude of dumped milk in the region. And this is just in the Wisconsin area. This is not something that was reported regularly, but we had something like 1.5 million pounds of milk that I could account for with relatively good records that said, yes, this was dumped per day, 1.5 million pounds of milk. But I also had a lot of folks that were saying anecdotally, it's probably closer to 5 million pounds of milk a day. And if we take a look at that, that's close to 5, or well, the 1.5 is maybe more like 2% of our milk production, and the 5 million pounds is probably closer to 6%. So somewhere in that range, we've got product that isn't finding a home. Why isn't it finding a home? Well, in a dairy plant, you need to recognize that they have a limited capacity to store product either at the plant or in cold storage facilities. And again, in calling around and talking with a few of the facilities that do store this, they're telling us that cold storage is very nearly full. So in the middle here, we haven't got a place to just put this product. Moreover, if you don't think you've got a sale for this product either now or, as Andy mentioned, in December when we have a big demand season going on, then it just simply doesn't make sense for that milk to get off of the farm, because the variable cost of production in dairy plants is extremely high. And by variable costs, I mean the costs associated with every pound of cheese or every gallon of milk you make. We all have fixed costs. Farms have fixed costs like the value of land or buildings or equipment that we have, but we also have variable costs of production there too, like feeding a cow. In a cheese plant or a fluid milk plant, the vast majority of your costs are variable, which means if you haven't got a sale for it, you'll lose much, much less by not processing it in the first place. And so that milk stays home and at the farm. That I think is largely what I wanted to talk about in the middle. We've worried about maybe some of what could happen to both plants that might be forced to close because of a viral positive ID in a plant. We've had very little of that. I believe that I've heard, and maybe Chris or Andy, you might let me know if that was true or not, but I think there was one plant in the Northeast that did have to quarantine for a period of time. But for the most part, plants are not seeing that. And I will say that if you haven't been in a dairy plant, you would perhaps be surprised to see just how clean those plants are operated, that you go in and you put on covers, clothes, hair nets, beard nets, you wash your hands going from one room to the next or walking through foot baths. They're just naturally, inherently clean from the way we conduct business. And frankly, the employee density in those plants is not great. So we aren't necessarily in close contact with our nearby neighbors, which is in contrast to some of the plants that we have in the news, like the meat packing plants, where there are a lot of employees and people are shoulder to shoulder. And if you get a positive COVID ID in there, you really are probably going to have to quarantine the plant and shut those down for a period of time. We haven't had much of that at all in dairy at this point in time. But I think that dairy plants could be vulnerable, not because we might lose an employee or two due to the illness, but because key employees might be hard to replace. So for example, if you have a laboratory employee that's highly skilled, or somebody who's operating a very complex piece of equipment in the plant, and they go down, it's not easy to find a substitute for those people in the short run. So a plant could falter for a period of time and not take the milk. We've also been concerned about our milk pickup at the farm level. In many parts of the country, and it's certainly true here in the upper Midwest, many of our milk hauling businesses are 1 and 2 truck operations. They just don't have a lot of backup labor there. And should they have to personally quarantine and not be able to conduct their business, then, you know, we've worried about whether or not milk could be picked up. But so far, I haven't heard about any of that yet. So that's kind of the nature of what's happening between the consumer and the farm.
Thank you, Mark. And for our audience here, that's well over 450 at this point, the neat thing about Mark and Andy and Chris, they've worked many years together on a dairy economists meeting, and obviously this year it's been canceled because of COVID-19, but interact quite a bit, deep thinkers, but willing to challenge one another. And Chris has spent about 2 decades here at Michigan, and now recently arrived in Ithaca, New York. And Chris, we're going to call on you to talk about the impacts on a dairy farm and maybe a few mitigation strategies. And so go ahead, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Yeah, as you said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the farm aspects of milk dumping. And Mark just did a nice job of talking about some of the issues that might happen at the plant that would make it maybe lead to some bottlenecks there in that supply chain. But let's talk just a little bit about what is milk dumping. So as Mark said, when the typical milk outlets are not available, the processing facilities, for some reason, co-ops are going to, co-ops and other milk handlers are going to search distant outlets looking for a home for the milk, possibly at distressed prices. But in some cases, the milk just ends up being dumped into the manure handling facilities, and that's the dumped milk. And that's the last resort, but it does occur in all markets from time to time due to things like power outages, weather events, and other issues between the farm and the plant. Federal milk marketing orders allow milk that's dumped, used for animal feed, or destroyed, or lost in an accident that's beyond the handler's control to be assigned to the lowest class use for that month, which is generally class 4, and it is at the current time. As long as that amount can be verified from records satisfactory for the market administrator. And typically, we're talking about a very small percentage, maybe 0.2 to 0.4% of the milk in any given month. But because of the demand and the supply chain issues around the current pandemic, it appears, right, as Mark was saying, that it's happening at a much larger scale than that at the current time. The farm implications then, dumped milk amounts and the component tests are typically measured and recorded and then reported to the market administrator. They're typically measured and recorded by somebody like the milk hauler that's trained and certified on how to do that. And then the regulated milk handler reports it to the market administrator. During the last few years, in a couple parts of the country, we've had some abnormal amounts of dumping, where the co-ops maybe determined which milk would be dumped and how it would occur, and made the measurements and reported it to the market administrator. And in those cases, it meant that the farm milk was picked up kind of like it generally was, but instead of headed towards the plant, it went to the manure handling facility. When we include this dumped milk in the federal milk marketing order pool, it dilutes the value of the pool, lowers the blend price, but that dumped milk earns a draw from the pool, which doesn't cover the cost of the dumped milk really at all, right? Like somebody like the co-op still has to come up with the money to pay the farmer the mailbox price. So it's not a positive situation. When the Northeast and Mideast orders in the last few years have had problems, the market administrators have relaxed the normal rules that made it easier to dump and verify that milk. Because the current level of dumping is beyond what we've seen in the past, and because there's human health considerations that Mark and Andy talked about with pickup and things like that, the market administrators have allowed in limited instances, if the situation is unavoidable, for farmers to measure and report the volumes, and for the component test to be determined by the most recent test and then possibly the next test that's available. So those are some of the farm aspects. What about things like the dairy margin coverage program and dairy RP and dumping? Well, if you think about the dairy revenue protection program, which is a lot of milk is covered this year, or a significant amount anyway, and that's a good thing. Well, in general, farmers, right, if you've covered milk production under dairy revenue protection, you have to produce at least 85% of that milk to maintain your coverage. Otherwise, they start adjusting it down. But given the current circumstances, the Risk Management Agency and USDA has new provisions to address the dumping and provide flexibility. And Risk Management Agency is allowing the dumped milk to be counted as qualified milk. So it doesn't lower your milk marketings and maintains qualification there. Also, they've allowed some of these transactions to be done electronically or over the phone so that you don't have to deal with that as far as certifying. Similar adjustments Risk Management Agency made for LGM Dairy. And then the dumped milk with the dairy margin coverage program, DMC eligibility should not be affected at all by milk dumping, because as long as you are still commercially producing milk, you qualify under that program.
We are going to accept questions now here, and we're going to open that up. If you'd like to submit your question, go ahead and ask your speakers. There's a chat feature on the side panel here of the session. And we're going to start out, we're getting questions coming in here, and we anticipated that. And where Chris and Andy are particularly going to be good on this topic is they're both based in regions that have experienced some milk dumping prior to COVID-19. But we alluded to this a little bit, but how are we going to track this dumped milk? Is it even possible? And Andy, I want to start with you on that and how this is going to look logistically.
So there are incidences, not in the Northeast, but in other parts of the country, where a farmer has decided to dump milk. Typically, this happens in the West, where it's a long, long haul to the next shipper, and the milk gets dumped, it doesn't get on the pool, and it's just gone. Kind of like leaving the pumpkins in the field in November. But more normally, the cooperative in particular has the ability to report milk that has been dumped as if it were delivered. And keep in mind that the people that are responsible for reporting are the regulated handlers. That has to appear on their report as if it were received. And the market administrator understands it was dumped and so on, but it still appears on the normal report where you put in all the milk for producer receipts. And cooperatives are able to do that. As Chris was saying, this enables the milk to be pooled. It enables it to become part of the blend price. It enables it to the cooperative is able to receive the pool draw on the value of that milk, which helps. It's not the whole thing, as Chris was saying, but it helps a lot. So from that standpoint, the normal situation is the regular truck driver comes out, puts the milk in the tank, does the measurements on volume, does the sampling, but instead of heading to the plant, it heads over to the lagoon or the digester. But otherwise, everything else about that transaction is just the same it normally is. And the only difference now is the MAs are relaxing the rules because there's so much of it going on. They're trying to say, well, if the truck driver can't come out, there can be another field inspector, somebody that's got a license to do these things. If it doesn't do that, then the farmer, him or herself, can do it. And so in the Northeast, that's been pretty much just straight normal business. You make a phone call to the MA, you got some dump milk, they say this is how we're going to verify it, and bam, you're all done in terms of certifying it. And of course, the MA and the handler then has a record of precisely how many pounds of dump milk there was and what the fat test was and so on.
Mark or Chris, anything to add on that one?
I'm going to ask Chris a quick question, though. I mean, okay, so you've indicated that we are going to have the ability, to somehow record or at least imagine what the milk production was, even if it got dumped for purposes of, like dairy revenue protection program. Do farmers need to do anything to make sure that that is somehow accounted for? I mean, should they be out there and take a time and date stamped photo of their dipstick and show that, yep, this was the amount of milk I produced, or what needs to happen? Anything?
Well, I think that it would be a good idea to take a bulk tank measurement and keep a record of that. Andy, are you aware of anything that's specifically required for that?
I think doing that sort of thing makes sense, and my guess is the government will be pretty accepting of records. But you can take a picture of a ruler with white liquid on it anytime you want and say this was my tank. So I think what's going to be a lot more persuasive is when the co-op backs up the records, and of course that's the way typically producers validate what their production histories are, is by going to their co-op and providing records, or potentially their handler if they're not a cooperative member. So I think that's going to be the first choice. Would I say don't bother collecting your own information? Absolutely not. I think that's a belt and suspenders approach.
Well, and I think you're going to be able to have, you'll have an idea what it was before the dumping and after the dumping. So, there's going to be some idea of what trend and how many cows you've got around. I think there are ways to back that up.
Sure.
There are people that are asking questions here in the webinar. Are there regions that you guys anticipate that are going to have to deal with this more, the dumping issue, and regions that maybe are less susceptible to it on the milk front?
Guys, I'd like to jump in on that one first, and not to crowd you out. But one reason why is the federal orders are just today releasing the uniform price announcements. And all of the orders have published them online except for the Southeast and Florida. And I spent a little time looking at those, and I think they're pretty revealing. And all I had time to do was to look at the March 2020 compared to March 2019. And what is the volume of producer receipts that's going into class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4? These particular reports do not identify dumped milk as a separate item. We're going to be able to see some of that, definitely for the Northeast and the Mideast, but at this point, that data are not available. And it shows three things that I think are really notable. One is March to March, year over year, for just that month, class 1 sales in all of those orders, except for the Southeast and Florida, is up 8%. It's not up exactly the same in every area, but actually it's pretty consistently up in all the orders. Class 2 is up 14%, and that varies a bit more from area to area. And of course, the volume of Class 2 varies a lot from area to area. It's a way big deal in the Northeast, not as big a deal, say, in Arizona. The one that took the huge hit, Badger lovers, is a Class 3. That's down 45% year over year. And that is less down in the upper Midwest than it is in other parts of the country. But that's a big hit. Now, you always have to keep in mind, you're never really sure how much is actually a change in volume and how much might be some kind of depooling going on. I don't know exactly why there would be depooling, but maybe there's some of that. But that's a pretty gigantic number. Class 4 is level, which I actually thought Class 4 would go up because that's where dump milk gets in. Now, here's the other kicker, point number 2, but it puts all these other numbers in perspective. Total producer receipts is down 9%. So Class 1's up 8 at the same time producer receipts going down 9. Class 4 is level at the same time producer receipts are down 9. The other thing that, looking order by order, although the average for these orders is down 9%, the East Coast orders have increased producer receipts and the Western orders have dropped like a rock. So I think what we're also seeing is a confirmation of a lot of reports that the co-ops in the West, Arizona, California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, have been much more aggressively creating programs to discourage milk production on farms. And that has not happened in the eastern states so much.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch, Andy, but I have no trouble imagining that some of those data that you talked about, and you made quick mention of it, may simply because milk was not pooled. And you said, I don't know why it wouldn't be pooled, but quite honestly, if it's not pooled, then you're welcome to pay quite easily whatever you want and need to pay for it. So milk can be depooled, and my guess is that we're going to see quite a bit of that happening too.
There's a proposal out there, obviously, by the National Milk Producers Federation and International Dairy Foods Association. There's a lot of elements to it, actually 4 pages to be exact. One of them would be potentially opening up the dairy margin coverage program. Another part would maybe even be some supply constrictions for a 6-month period. Those things would all have to be enacted by Congress, wouldn't they? Or does the USDA secretary have any authority under this? What does that look like? We're getting a lot of questions on that here from our viewers.
Well, I think it's a little bit variable. There are some of those things for which the secretary probably can unquestionably do on his own, and some of which we think would probably need some kind of congressional head nodding, if not actual law passed. But during these particular times, there may be more flexibility than we would otherwise imagine. So, for example, I suspect that with regard to the dairy margin coverage program, a program that we have in place and which would be more of a rules change than most anything else, I'm betting that the Secretary of Agriculture has the authority to do that. But, with regard to implementing a direct payment requiring reduction of milk to receive it, that may be a little bit more questionable. I don't know. Andy, you've had a lot more time and thinking about these things.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mark, completely. I think one of the things that we all have to keep in mind is Congress gets to write the laws, but they don't implement anything. The executive branch, the Secretary of Agriculture, the President, they get to implement the laws, but they don't get to write them. So the only thing that the President or the Secretary of Agriculture can do is stuff where there's existing legislation that says you can do it. And the big one that pertains here is the Commodity Credit Corporation Charter Act, which is this kind of big savings account that USDA can go to spend money on certain initiatives. And the market facilitation program that gave some farmers checks and also did a little bit of demand stuff is an excellent example of that kind of flexibility. So I think the recourse loan idea that was presented primarily by IDFA pretty sure you could do that under the Commodity Credit Corporation. Making payments to farmers where they're required to reduce production, that sounds like a stretch to me, but I'm not a lawyer. Making payments into the pool to compensate for milk that was dumped and didn't earn any money, that strikes me as probably a little more likely, but even there, I'd definitely be wanting to talk to more than one lawyer to be sure I felt good about that. And the opening up the dairy margin coverage, there's no way in the world the Secretary of Agriculture can do that, in my humble opinion.
This question comes in, actually, I'm sorting through them here with the help of Caitlin and Maggie from a dairyman that I know, and he would be selling to a proprietary plant and they're not taking all the milk right now. And I think what his question is, can I, as a farmer, sell my milk to someone else if my handler won't take it? First off, you've got to find someone willing to buy it. But is there any additional insight on that one? That's a tough one, I know.
I don't think that's a tough one. I think if you're an independent producer selling to a proprietary handler, you can do whatever you damn well please with your milk. If you're selling to a cooperative, you have a membership agreement that says, I will market all my milk through my cooperative. And there are times when you do some farmstead processing or have some kind of side deal, but the co-op has to agree to that because your membership agreement in most co-ops is you're going to market all of your milk through the cooperative. If I can't imagine a situation where a co-op would say, oh, you want to market the part of it to somebody else, go ahead. But, in current times, who knows what's out there, but that would be a real exception to the rule.
Mark, I'm going to kick this one over to you. You talked about it a little bit in your opening statements here, but would dumping be happening to the same extent if processing plants were more diversified in their abilities and customers? And I think part of that is talking about a modern plant. Go ahead.
Well, that's actually one of those questions that's kind of crossed my mind a little bit more recently. My perception, is that we in the U.S. are struggling with this a little bit more than we see in some other countries. Admittedly, COVID is impacting dairy industries across the world. No doubt about that. However, we've got plants that are highly, highly specialized. They bring in large volumes of milk. They make one or two products, and those products have sales channels that are, well lubricated for that particular plant and those particular customers. But it's hard for us to make such big changes in a short term. When you go to a dairy plant in Germany, when you go to a dairy plant in Australia, when you go to dairy plants in other parts of the world, they typically have an association with a cluster or a group of farms. And they take all the milk from those farms, whatever they're producing over the course of a year, which means that they are going to have to do balancing within the plant. They don't send loads of milk off to some other plant to balance. They handle it right there. And those plants are typically producing a whole suite of products. They might put milk in jugs. They might make yogurt. They might make cheese. They might powder some milk, do everything right there. So they're a little bit more adept at making some changes rather quickly when you have a big switch in customer demands for the product. And I think that we've traded a little bit of efficiency in the kind of plants that we operate here for some flexibility or even resiliency that you see in other countries.
Andy, you started talking about that. Chris and Mark, you certainly have experience here on this. We talked about supply chain reductions, and I'm talking about supply constrictions, maybe from a co-op. You talked about that out west, Andy. So far, most of that has been within proprietary plants or cooperatives. There's really nothing from the national perspective other than a proposal out there. But maybe expand on that a little bit here just to separate that out so the viewers can understand the differences there.
Yeah, so we actually have 3 different experiences of programs that were intended to restrain production growth or even decrease production. One were federal programs, such as we had in the 1980s with the temporary reductions, partial reductions of the so-called milk diversion program, and then the buyout program, or the dairy termination program, as it was officially called. And that had the sanction of a government program, and people could choose to participate or not choose, but it was completely legal because it was part of legislation. A private company can engage, including a cooperative, can engage in some ways of restraining how much milk or product it will take. And all you got to do is think about the flow of pigs to a pork processor, to the flow of chickens into a layer or a broiler operation. How many sweet peas a company is going to buy? All of those are companies that are routinely saying, this is how much I can buy and this is the price, and there's a restraint on that. So that's completely legal to do as well. Might be unpopular, doesn't mean it's easy, but it's certainly legal. The third one was like the CWT, which was a jointly coordinated action across a number of separate businesses. And that one, the legality of that is somewhat uncertain. And the fact that the National Milk Producers Federation and its cooperative members have suspended the herd reduction program kind of suggests that they decided that maybe that wasn't a good approach for them to do from a legal standpoint, regardless of whatever it might have done economically. And so that leaves you with, will the government do something? Which maybe, who's to say? These are crazy times. If you would have asked me 3 months ago, what's the chance that the federal government would engage in anything that looks like supply management? I'd say not a snowball's chance, but certainly that's a little different scenario now, especially if it were temporary. And then that leaves every individual business, cooperative in particular, to make their own choices. And I think that can be effective, but of course it lacks coordination and makes it not always feel like maybe it's as equitable across everybody as we'd like. But I think when it comes right down to it, we're going to do what we can do and then see where we can push on the government to get more, and maybe it'll happen and maybe it won't.
Even Canada right now, from everything I've been reading up there, most of the provinces are dumping milk as well because there's been disruptions there, even with supply management. I got this question very early on from some coworkers here in the office, and some viewers are asking this here as well. Couldn't some of this milk be diverted to milk powder or UHT milk and stored for quite a long period of time? And what I've learned, and maybe I don't have the exact numbers, but most of these plants, even the powder plants, are running at 95+% capacity. There's just not enough capacity out there. Chris, you're nodding your head there. Go ahead.
Well, I was talking to somebody that operates works with one of those plants the other day, and they said that they completely all out, right? Which normally they wouldn't be using all of that capacity until we got into the spring flush, right? So, but they were already going, 3 shifts, just doing everything they could to try to find a home for that milk. And I will say, in some parts of the country, like the Northeast and the Mideast, and in some parts of the West and stuff, because the last 5 years have strained the market balancing capacity, it's been pretty surprising to me how good the dairy industry has been at getting capacity and efficiency out of these plants. You talk to a co-op, and they had kind of always thought this plant was 1 million pounds a day, but now we're doing over 2 million pounds a day. And so American business in general, but especially the dairy industry, has been pretty good about squeezing the efficiencies out. But all those efficiencies, as Mark said, were keyed around the market outlets that we kind of were counting on, as far as the food service versus eat at home. And so, I think this whole thing maybe makes you rethink the risk management aspects of some of the supply chains, because human beings tend to kind of assess probabilities based on their recent experiences.
We're going to wrap up here today with one more question, because I think it's one that people are really interested in seeing and hearing about, because there's the other part of it. Caitlin will put my script back up here. Let's talk, one of the things, if we're going to be reducing milk production in some places here, we're going to have to cull some cows. And what is the effect of shutting down on beef processing plants around the U.S. have on dairy cull price and just a place to go with them?
Yeah, this is a problem. And, I think that we're going to be looking at a lot of different strategies for reducing milk production, depending on the form that reduction takes. So if we wanted to just get out of business, say, I'm done now, I can't handle this any longer, we may not have a lot of sale opportunities for lactating animals during this crisis. And that, suggests that these animals have to go to livestock auctions and cull yards. Many of our livestock auctions have not been open the normal operating hours. Either there are fewer days a week that they're there to take animals, and that's partly because those plants are closed down too. We've got 2 or 3 plants that have actually closed, processing capacity for beef animals, not just the pork that we've seen in South Dakota. So this is a problem, no question about it. That suggests that other strategies could be dry off early. Let's get some animals non-lactating at least, and not feeding them as much. The other possibility is perhaps we want to just take many parts of the herd down to lower levels of production by feeding them less. I'm not sure what the optimal strategy is. Some of it depends on how long you think this is going to last.
Anything to add, Chris or Mark?
Look forward to your next questions on the next one. We got plenty of questions queued up.
Well, we will be bringing this program to you next week here, Wednesday, April 22nd, 2020. Same time, next week's program will be sponsored by our friends at Cargill. And Wednesday, April 29th, our friends at Lalamad will be joining us in the partnership here. We're going to sort through, we got a lot of questions we didn't get to today. We're going to sort through those over the next week here and queue those up here with Andy, Mark, and Chris here. Lastly, I think I really want to leave everyone with this. We appreciate everyone on the dairy farm and all those working in the supply chain here. This is truly the time. Hardworking folks are being recognized for the good they do for their fellow citizens. Quite frankly, in my opinion, it's refreshing not to be hearing from entertainers and sports figures. After all, nutrition delivered by food and extra health delivered by our healthcare workers really matter most during this pandemic. On behalf of Andy, Mark, and Chris, and our production crew of Maggie, Caitlin, and Jim, I really thank you for being with us today. We will be putting out a special Hordes Dairyman Intel tomorrow for those who subscribe to that, and we will be putting this webcast live, the archive of it, on our website at www.hordes.com here by Thursday morning as well. Thanks again for viewing. We appreciate it. Goodbye.